Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into a topic that's, well, kind of huge. Terrorism.
Yeah, no shortage of material out there. We've got UN reports, Homeland Security frameworks, even Edward Snowden's take on those pager bombings in Lebanon.
Wild stuff. So, where do we even begin with all this?
Well, gotta start with the foundation.
Yeah.
We'll trace how terrorism has evolved historically,
Yeah.
take a peek into the psychology behind it.
And hopefully by the end of this, we can answer the big question, are counterterrorism efforts actually working?
Exactly. It's not just about understanding the what, but also the how and the why.
Okay, first things first. That UN module, the one on international terrorism,
Yeah,
blew my mind. I mean, I knew terrorism had been around, but they trace it back to ancient times. I always thought it was like a modern thing.
it's easy to think that with all the headlines.
Right.
But one thing that really struck me, it's like those early tactics
Yeah.
often mirrored the warfare of their time. You can almost draw a straight line between the two. Think about it. Demobilized soldiers coming home, their only skills, combat skills.
Right.
Makes you wonder about the lasting impact of war,
Yeah.
not just on individuals, but like whole societies.
Absolutely. And then there's, I mean, this is kind of wild, but the word terrorism itself comes straight from the French Revolution, the reign of terror.
Oh, yeah, grim reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control and how violence, even when it's cloaked in revolution, has devastating consequences.
It's like history has a way of repeating itself, you know? Fear and violence, they're tactics as old as time.
Sadly, yeah.
And it's not just ancient history either. The UN module points to World War I as a turning point. What was it about that conflict specifically?
World War I.
Yeah,
That's when we saw the rise of total war, right? That no-holds-barred approach.
right.
And I think that really bled into how non-state actors began to operate, like a dark inheritance shaping the methods, the ideologies of so many conflicts that followed.
Wow. So these more extreme tactics, they kind of seeped into the broader context of conflict.
Yeah, it's a chilling thought for sure.
It is. And it's almost like we're hardwired to repeat these patterns. Speaking of echoes, the UN report also talks about how the League of Nations, they really struggled to even define what terrorism is, you know?
Right, massive definitional issues.
There were all these problems with extradition because of that political offense loophole. Like, one country's terrorist is another's freedom fighter, right?
It's incredible how much those same debates are still raging on today.
Yeah.
Impacts everything. International law, domestic counterterrorism.
Totally. It's almost like the very nature of terrorism, the fact that it's so fluid, depends on who's doing the defining,
Right.
makes it nearly impossible to pin down. Makes me think of that line in the UN module, something like, definitional issues have continued to the present day. Talk about an understatement.
Yeah, and until we can agree on what we're even talking about, combating it effectively is,
A long shot.
to say the least. And that actually leads us to a pretty crucial point, the psychology of terrorism. We need to go beyond labels and sound bites
Right.
and really delve into the complex factors that drive individuals down this path.
Because there's this common misconception, right, that terrorists are just inherently crazy or mentally unstable. But Randy Borum's paper, the one on the psychology of terrorism, really challenges that, don't you think?
Absolutely. He argues that it's not about a terrorist personality, at least not in the way most people think.
So what is it then?
It's a perfect storm, really, a combination of psychological and social factors that create vulnerabilities. And unfortunately, terrorist organizations, they're experts at exploiting those vulnerabilities.
So vulnerabilities. Okay, but how do those vulnerabilities actually get exploited? What's going on in the mind of someone who's, being drawn into terrorism?
That's where it gets really interesting. Borum's paper, it talks about these three key motivational themes that terrorist groups manipulate: injustice, identity, and belonging. And these themes are powerful, right? Because they tap into these fundamental human needs, desires.
Yeah, totally. It's like they're offering a dark reflection of what we all crave, right? Purpose, community, the chance to fight for something bigger than yourself.
Exactly. Take the theme of injustice, for example.
Okay.
Terrorist groups, they offer this narrative of righteous anger, retribution. They promise to right perceived wrongs, to deliver justice for those who feel marginalized, oppressed.
It's like channeling that feeling of injustice into action, right?
Yes.
Giving people an outlet for their rage, their frustrations, even if it's like directed at a really nebulous enemy or ideology.
Absolutely.
Right.
And then there's the allure of identity, belonging. Those are huge.
Yeah.
Terrorist groups, they provide this sense of camaraderie, a brotherhood, a sisterhood. It can be incredibly intoxicating, especially for individuals who feel lost, isolated, alienated from mainstream society.
It's like they're offering this place to belong, right? A
Yeah.
group where you're accepted, you're valued,
Yeah.
even if that acceptance comes with, well,
A hefty price tag.
yeah, blind loyalty, violence.
Wow.
It's interesting, though, in that module about the psychology of terrorism, they touch on this whole idea of moral disengagement.
Oh, yeah.
And they're basically saying it's a key part of how people justify these horrific acts.
Right, that's Bandura's work, right? Social psychologist Albert Bandura. And it's essential to understanding how people who, on the surface, might not seem bad, how they can commit these acts. It's like moral disengagement is this process of rationalization, a way to silence that inner voice screaming, this is wrong.
So instead of seeing themselves as monsters, they're the heroes,
Yeah.
right? Fighting for a cause they believe in, a cause that justifies anything.
Exactly. Bandura, he outlines several mechanisms of moral disengagement. One of the most common, dehumanization,
Ah,
by portraying the enemy as less than human, as monsters, animals. It becomes easier to disregard their suffering, to justify the violence committed against them. Propaganda is full of this stuff.
Oh, we see this all the time in the news, right? The way certain groups are demonized, stripped of their humanity.
Yeah.
It makes it so much easier to dismiss, even celebrate the violence against them.
Exactly. And then there's euphemistic labeling, using sanitized language to mask the brutality of what's being done.
Like what?
So instead of killing, it's neutralizing targets or conducting surgical strikes.
Putting lipstick on a pig? It's still awful.
Exactly. And let's not forget about diffusion of responsibility.
Oh, right. The whole just following orders kind of thing.
Exactly. In a group setting, individuals, they feel less personal accountability for their actions, right? I was just following orders, or it's not my fault, everyone else is doing it.
The group becomes a shield, in a way, protecting them from facing the consequences, letting them maintain this sense of moral righteousness.
Precisely. And all these mechanisms, they often work in tandem, creating this potent cocktail that allows individuals to disconnect from their moral compass. They end up doing things they never thought possible.
It's chilling when you really think about it, but I mean, we have to confront this stuff head on if we want to even try to understand the root of terrorism. Speaking of confronting things head on, let's talk about how effective our counterterrorism efforts actually are. We've got this paper, Measuring the Effectiveness of America's War on Terror, and, well, it's pretty sobering.
It is.
It really is.
Yeah. Despite everything, all the resources we've poured into the war on terror, the military deployments, the intelligence gathering, the sheer financial cost, the paper argues that a lot of the key objectives, they're still unmet. And in some areas, things have actually gotten worse.
So we're fighting this uphill battle and maybe even losing ground. What are some of the specific things the paper points to?
Well, one of the main goals was to reduce the threat of terrorism, right?
Yeah.
Domestically and internationally.
Right.
But we're seeing new terrorist groups pop up, extremist ideologies spreading online.
Right.
Their tactics constantly evolving.
Yeah.
It's like the threat is more widespread, more complex, and arguably even harder to contain. It's a nightmare.
It's like that whack-a-mole thing, right? You try to suppress one group, one ideology, and another one pops up somewhere else.
Exactly. And often, fueled by the very actions we take to try and combat them, it's the worst kind of cycle.
It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Oof, yeah, good analogy.
You might extinguish a few flames, but you also risk making the whole thing bigger, more dangerous in the long run.
100%. And this is where I think those recent pager bomb attacks in Lebanon, they become a really fascinating case study.
Okay.
Because we're talking about the evolution of terrorism, the unintended consequences, the blurring lines between state and non-state actors. In this event, it kind of brings all those themes together in this bizarre, disturbing way.
Okay, so Lebanon, pager bombs. Let's unpack this. First off, what actually happened for those of us who, haven't been glued to the news cycle 24/7.
Right. So basically you had multiple pager devices, ones being used by members of Hezbollah. They were detonated remotely.
Right.
Caused casualties in different locations across Lebanon.
Wait, pagers? Like those things we thought went extinct in like the 90s. Who even USCS pagers anymore, let alone for terrorism?
Well, Hezbollah, apparently. Reports suggest they switched back to pagers because they thought their cell phone networks might be compromised.
Oh, wow. So they try to go old school for security reasons, and it backfires spectacularly.
You could say that, but what's really wild here is the tactic itself. Remotely detonated pagers as weapons. It's like something out of a spy thriller, except it's real life.
Yeah, no kidding. And then there's the whole question of who's actually behind
Oh,
it.
right, because nobody's officially claimed responsibility,
Right.
but
That
all signs point to Israel.
exactly. And that's where Edward Snowden's take on it gets really interesting. He called the attacks indistinguishable from terrorism.
Which is huge, right? Because it shines a light on this really murky world of state-sponsored terrorism.
Yeah.
Even if a government doesn't come out and say, yep, we did it, if the evidence points that way.
Yeah.
It raises serious questions about accountability on a global scale.
It's a total mess. And it makes you wonder, as technology gets even more sophisticated,
Oh, absolutely.
are we even going to be able to tell the difference between a state-sponsored attack and one carried out by, like, a non-state actor?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's at the heart of the future of counterterrorism. This case in Lebanon, it's like everything's getting blurred, the lines between traditional warfare, terrorism.
Yeah.
It's like the old rule book's been thrown out.
So where do we go from here? I mean, if we're in this world where the lines are blurred, the tactics are changing faster than we can keep up, and technology is a double-edged sword, what do we do about it?
It's a tough one, for sure. But I think we have to start by acknowledging there's no easy fix. No single policy, no magic bullet that's going to solve this. It's complex. We need a multi-pronged approach.
So more than just, like, military force or intelligence gathering.
Absolutely. Those are important, of course, but we also have to look at the underlying conditions, the things that allow terrorism to flourish in the first place. We're talking poverty, inequality, political disenfranchisement. We need to address the root causes.
So it's not just about fighting terrorists, it's about fighting the conditions that create them.
100%. It's about building societies where people feel hope, where they see opportunities, where they feel a sense of belonging. That's how you make those extremist narratives less appealing.
That sounds like a long game, though. Like, how do we even begin to create that kind of change on a global scale?
It's not easy, that's for sure. It takes a sustained commitment to diplomacy, to development, to dialogue. And it also means taking a hard look at some of our current counterterrorism strategies.
You're talking about those unintended consequences again.
Exactly. We have to get better at anticipating those and making sure that in our efforts to combat terrorism, we're not actually fueling the fire.
Right. Like, we don't want to create more problems than we solve.
Exactly. So that means building trust, working with communities that are vulnerable to radicalization, partnering with local organizations, and being open to adjusting our strategies as we go. Because what works in one context might completely backfire in another.
It's about being flexible,
Right.
adaptable.
Absolutely. We need to move beyond a purely reactive approach. Just responding to each attack as it happens and be more proactive. Address those deeper systemic issues we were talking about.
Right. Get ahead of the curve rather than always playing catch up.
Exactly. It's a shift in mindset, really. Moving away from a purely security-focused approach and embracing a more holistic one. Because at the end of the day, true security, it comes from building a world that's more just, more equitable for everyone.
I love that. So if there's one big takeaway from all of this, from all the reports, the analysis, the historical context, what would it be?
That there is no single answer. Combating terrorism in all its evolving forms, it demands that we adapt, that we learn, that we constantly challenge our assumptions,
We have to stay informed, stay engaged.
and stay curious.
Exactly. And never be afraid to ask the hard questions, even when the answers are messy and complicated.
Well said.
This has been a wild ride for sure. But seriously, thank you so much for taking the time to break it all down with us.
Anytime.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep learning, keep questioning. And until next time, stay curious.